By the time Mooney shut the doors in Kerrville in the fall of 2019, they were building the finest airplane that ever wore the name. The M20V Acclaim Ultra would true out north of 230 knots up high, faster than anything else flying with a piston in the nose and a single propeller out front. And she did it on less gas than a Bonanza while carrying a full Garmin G1000NXI panel, a composite cabin top, real headroom, and 2 honest doors a grown man could climb through without folding himself in half. Spec sheet to spec sheet, it was the best M20 in 66 years of trying. And in 3 years of building it, they sold 10. Cirrus, up in Duluth, was moving better than 370 airplanes a year across that same stretch, and Mooney had a front row seat for all of it. They weren't blindsided by a world that quietly moved on without them. They watched the whole thing roll toward them for 20 years in plain daylight, with the numbers printed in the same trade magazines they read every single month. And they kept right on building the airplane they wanted to build for a customer who had already walked out of the room. Mooney knew how to walk that customer right back in, and they proved it. The Ultra was Mooney finally reading the market and doing something about it. And most of what they did was exactly right. But they stopped one decision short of the finish line, and the decision they refused to make was the one the whole market was begging them to make. They did half the job beautifully. The other half was a parachute, and they would sooner have padlocked the factory than bolt one on. The airplane itself is the one thing nobody can pin the blame on. Al Mooney's 20th design first flew in 1953 and earned its ticket in 1955, built around a welded chromoly steel cage like the roll structure in a stock car, wrapped in light aluminum skin, riding a laminar flow wing with Mustang aerodynamics in its bloodline, and that backward-leaning tail that told you what it was from a mile out. The whole idea was speed you didn't pay for in horsepower, clean enough through the air that she'd run away from airplanes carrying a lot more engine, simply because she gave the wind less to grab. Over the next 6 decades, they sharpened that idea without ever really changing it. The C and E models of the 60s gave way to the M20J in the late 70s, the airplane they called the 201, because it would do 201 miles an hour on 200 horsepower, and they hung the number right on the cowl. Turbocharged versions followed. The K, the 252, the Bravo, each one wringing a little more speed out of the same basic airframe. By the 90s, the M20R Ovation showed up with a big-bore 280-horse Continental IO 550 and a stretched fuselage, truing 190 knots on about 15 gallons an hour, the fastest normally aspirated single you could buy with a clear conscience. More than 11,000 of them came out of Kerrville across every variant, and an airplane that quick on that little gas earns a fierce kind of owner. The type who flies the same one for 30 years and won't hear a word against it. Mooney grew a whole community of them, and that loyalty would come back to haunt them. By 2013, there was Chinese money behind the company, the Meijing Group buying in through a subsidiary called Soaring American, and fresh capital flowed in. The line restarted in early 2014 with 135 people back on it, and they used that money to do something Mooney had needed to do for 50 years. They took the airplane apart and finally fixed the things buyers had been griping about since the Johnson administration. The old metal cabin top came off and a composite shell went on in its place, which let them reshape the roof, cut in bigger glass, and give a tall man room for his head. They added a second door on the pilot's side because every Mooney ever built made you thread yourself in through one door on the right, like you were posting a letter. And for half a century, the company had just shrugged and let you do it. New seats, better soundproofing, a cabin you'd actually want to sit in. Up front, a factory G1000NXI with synthetic vision, the GFC 700 autopilot, the whole kit. Underneath it all the same good bones, the 310-horse Continental, the laminar wing, the steel cage, the gear that tucked away clean. And it worked. The reviews came back warm. The cabin finally felt like a place worth spending 4 hours of your life, and the airplane was still the fastest thing in its class by a comfortable margin. So Mooney was no clueless outfit that couldn't see what the market wanted. They saw it fine. They had the engineers, they had the cash, they had the will, and they aimed every bit of it at the cabin, the doors, and the panel, and got all three right. They knew precisely how to hand the modern buyer what he was asking for. Then they turned around and withheld the one thing he wanted most. A company that couldn't read the market would just be a sad accident, the kind of slow fade that happens to old outfits nobody's steering anymore. Mooney read the market cold and spent real money proving it, then handed the buyer everything except the chute, with the evidence stacked on the table right in front of them. That stops looking like ignorance and starts looking like delusion. It's a choice made on purpose, and that's the whole difference between getting unlucky and being stupid. By the time the Ultra showed up, Cirrus had already won the argument about safety, and they'd won it with a red handle in the ceiling. The whole airframe parachute, caps, the canopy that floats the entire airplane down when everything else has gone to hell, had quit being a gimmick and become the whole sales pitch. It changed who you could sell an airplane to. The buyer had changed, and Mooney never made peace with it. The old buyer was a hardcore stick, an instrument pilot who flew real weather, loved the workload, and wanted the slickest, fastest machine he could get his hands on. That had been Mooney's man for 40 years. The new buyer was a surgeon, a business owner, a software guy, somebody who came to aviation with plenty of money and not many hours, and he wanted a glass panel that made sense on day one, room for the family, and a safety story he could tell the person sitting in the right seat. Cirrus handed him every piece of that, and the centerpiece was the chute. Whatever the worry was, a nervous spouse, an insurance man who didn't like the numbers, a low-time pilot stepping up from a 172 into his first fast airplane, the answer was the same red handle in the roof. And it had stopped being a theory. By 2018, that handle had been pulled 79 times and walked 163 people away from airplanes that were going down, real folks still breathing. The number printed in black and white and climbing every year. Mooney looked at all of that and said no. They had the engineering muscle to build a chute into the airplane and the cash to pay the bill, and they chose not to, because the chute didn't fit the story they told about themselves. And the story was the steel cage. The chromoly roll structure, the seats rated to take 26 Gs, the airbags sewn into the belts, a cabin built to crush in all the right places and keep you alive while it did. Mooney talked about that airframe the way other men talk about scripture. In their world, a parachute was a confession that your airplane couldn't save you, and a real Mooney pilot flew the airplane to the ground and let the cage do its work. The chute was for the Cirrus crowd, the folks who didn't really want to fly. We fly the airplane. That was the line, said right out loud on the forums and in the press all the way up until the lights went out. There was a real engineering wrinkle under the pride, and they deserve credit for it. A whole airframe chute runs around 80 pounds, eats your baggage room, and needs hard points built into the structure to take the jerk when it opens. Cirrus drew a wide composite airplane around the thing from the very first sketch. Mooney was working with a narrow steel and aluminum design penciled in the 1950s, where every pound was already spoken for by speed and every cubic inch of cabin was already full. So fitting a chute meant a serious redesign and a certification bill with a long row of zeros on it. All of that is true, and none of it saved them, because the market had already told them what skipping the chute would cost, and that bill was bigger. The smoking gun was sitting in plain view, and Mooney could never claim they didn't see it coming. Somebody had already run the exact experiment for them and nailed the result up on the wall. Cessna built the TTX, a slick, fast, composite single with no parachute and a premium price pointed straight at Cirrus. Fine airplane. It died. Smaller support network, a higher sticker than a chute-equipped SR-22T, no red handle in the roof, and the market simply would not have it, so Cessna killed it off. The thing spelled out plainly that a fast single with no chute priced north of the Cirrus could not win. Mooney walked past that fresh corpse, gave it a good long look, and said, "We're different. We've got the cage." They were not different enough. They were the same losing bet with a steel tube frame in place of carbon fiber, and they placed it anyway, after watching it come up empty. The scoreboard had been hollering the same thing for 2 decades besides. Cirrus shipped its first SR-20 in 1999 and the SR-22 in 2001, And by 2003, the SR-22 was the best-selling piston single on the planet. By 2013, they'd passed Textron, Cessna, and Beech together to become the biggest piston builder going. By 2018, they were pushing 380 airplanes out the door a year, while Mooney built 14. None of that snuck up on a soul. It happened slowly, in public, one annual delivery report at a time, and every one of those reports was a fresh chance to turn the wheel. Mooney read them and kept building. Some of what killed Mooney wasn't a call anybody made on purpose. It was arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't give a damn how good your airplane is. Mooney built a dozen airplanes a year by hand, and a dozen a year can't carry the cost of building them, so the sticker had to climb. The Ovation Ultra listed in the high 600s, the Acclaim pushed toward the mid-7s and loaded up with TKS ice protection and air conditioning and a nice interior. A finished one cleared $800,000. At that kind of money, you weren't shopping against other Mooneys anymore. You were shopping against a Cirrus SR-22T, a G36 Bonanza, and in a pinch a tired old turboprop, and the comparison was rough. The SR-22T gave you a wider cabin, the chute, a huge owner community, factory training, and resale that held its water, all for about the same check. The Bonanza gave you 6 seats and a cabin-class feel. Against either one, Mooney's whole pitch came down to roughly this. For the same money, 2 fewer seats, narrower cabin, no chute, and I'll give you 10 or 20 knots. That wins the argument in the hangar every time. It loses the one that happens at the kitchen table with a spouse and an accountant in the room. Under the sticker was the trap nobody could climb out of. The Ultra program, the composite shell, the new doors, the crash testing, the panel work, the recertification, all of it cost real money up front, and that bill had to be spread across the handful of airplanes the factory turned out. That's how a narrow 4-seat retract ends up wearing the same price tag as a mainstream Cirrus. There was no way to make the math close at that volume, and no way to build more without dropping the price. The math wouldn't allow, so the whole thing just chased its own tail straight down the drain. By the time the Ultra hit the market, there were thousands of older Mooneys already out there. J's and K's and Ovations and Bravos, all of them fast, proven, and trading for a quarter to a third of what a new airplane cost. Drop $150,000 into a clean used Ovation, fresh engine, modern glass, new leather, and you'd walk away with an airplane that did 90% of what an Ultra did for maybe half the money out the door. And the folks who'd most appreciate an Ultra, the hardcore Mooney people who live for the speed, who fly serious weather, who never wanted a parachute in the first place, were exactly the ones sharp enough to run that math in their heads and act on it. They didn't need a factory G1000 when a GTN 750XI and a pair of GI 275s did the same job. So Mooney's best customers had a beautiful way out. Buy used, upgrade, pocket the difference. The airplane's own legend turned out to be the cheapest competitor it had, and the company was selling against itself. Losing the faithful to the used market would have hurt less if Mooney were pulling in fresh blood up front. It wasn't, and the reason runs back to the same root. Mooney never really marketed, and for most of its life, that was the right call. The thinking, as far as anybody could tell from the outside, was that serious buyers do their own homework. They read AOPA and flying, they walk Oshkosh, they talk to their mechanic, and they already know what a Mooney is. So why burn money making videos for people who watch YouTube? In 1990, that was just plain true. The man buying a fast retract was an instrument pilot with a subscription and a standing relationship with his A&P. By 2018, the man buying that same airplane was a CEO who typed best IFR traveling airplane into Google and fell straight down a Cirrus rabbit hole. Factory promos and owner stories and safety films and lifestyle reels, a whole content machine with the category practically trademarked, and he'd made up his mind before he ever ran across the name Mooney. Search Cirrus and you drown in the stuff. Search Mooney Acclaim Ultra and you get a handful of third-party flight reviews and some classified ads. And all of this was happening on top of a foundation that had been cracked for decades. Mooney's history reads like a hospital chart, and the patient was never healthy for long. Chapter 7 in 1969, 3 years after a record run of 767 airplanes. Bought, flipped, merged into Aerostar, the name dropped entirely. Kerrville padlocked in 1971 and left sitting empty for better than 2 years. Republic Steel restarted it in 1973 and brought in Roy Lopresti, whose aerodynamic cleanup is what gave us the 201, and then Republic got swallowed by LTV in 1984, and Mooney was cut loose again. A management buyout, more sales. Chapter 11, the second time around in the early 2000s, the assets shuffled from one holding company to the next. By the count that matters, the company changed hands at least 11 times in 65 years. A new owner about every 6 years, and every cycle ran the identical play. Fresh money in, line restarts, hopes up, sales flat, layoffs, lights out. The 2008 recession dropped the hammer in November of that year, when Mooney halted all production and let go 229 of 320 people. 25 finished airplanes sitting out on the ramp with nobody to buy them. By 2010, the place was down to under 10 souls, just enough to keep the type certificate warm and ship spare parts while somebody went hunting for the next investor. That track record poisoned the one thing a small airplane builder absolutely cannot afford to lose. When a man writes a $750,000 check for a single-engine airplane, he needs to believe the outfit that built it will still be standing in 5 years to back it up. Mooney gave him nothing to believe in. Cirrus, meanwhile, was boring in the very best way. Stable, growing every single year, deep in the pockets, with a fleet so big the parts and the support were guaranteed by sheer headcount. One of those companies looked like a sure thing. The other looked like a coin flip, and it had already come up tails 11 times. So when the doors finally closed in 2019, the airplane on the line was a masterpiece. The Acclaim Ultra was the last and best word on a design 66 years in the making. The thing you'd build if somebody handed you a blank sheet of paper and said, "Make me the perfect M20." The iron was never the trouble. The trouble was the people running the company, who built that beautiful airplane and pointed it at a buyer who'd already moved on, priced it for a fight it could not win, and sold it with a safety story the rest of the world had quietly retired. They did the hard, expensive, brilliant work of modernizing the cabin and the doors and the panel, and then they stopped one decision short and refused the parachute on principle, and the parachute was the half that closed the sale. Half the job done magnificently. The other half, the half the entire market was pointing straight at, left undone out of pride. The pride kept cutting the same way every time. The best airplane they ever built sold 10 copies. The 11,000-strong legend they'd spent 60 years building turned into the cheapest competitor they had, and the steel cage they worshipped, the very thing meant to keep their pilots alive, is what made the airplane impossible to sell the day the market decided it wanted to shoot. Mooney went under because it stayed 1985 Mooney in a 2020 Cirrus world, and the writing had been up on that wall the whole time, in big plain letters, for anybody willing to read it. They just kept painting over it and calling the wall clean. So, that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.